Good morning, everyone. I'm Carlin Bowman, and I'm a senior fellow here at AEI, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the 5th annual BYU Brigham Young University Deseret News Survey on the American Family. It's been a real pleasure to be associated with this survey's advisory committee with Richard Reeves of the Brookings Institution, Brad Wilcox of UVA and AEI, Marcy Carlson of the University of Wisconsin. We've tried to provide some input for the talented survey researchers of Jeremy Pope and Chris Karpowitz at BYU. We're also joined today by Aparna Mathur, a wonderful colleague of mine, an economist here at AEI, who with Bell Sawhill at Brookings heads the working group on American families. Here's why I think this survey is important. Every day my inbox is just inundated with polls of different sorts. In the last week, I had 7 new polls on the 2020 presidential contest, 3 polls on gun control, 1 on climate change, 2 on the economy, in addition, a massive new survey on foreign policy attitudes, and then there was a poll on amending the Communications Decency Act. And finally, and I kid you not, a poll from Survation in Britain, one of the big survey firms there. This was commissioned by a number of Oxford University scientists, and they asked Brits how Brits wanted to communicate with extraterrestrials should they ever decide to call. I kid you not. What's missing from all of this activity is anything about how Americans live their daily lives. The BYU Deseret News polls fills that void. The survey was originally designed to measure 3 key concepts: attitudes and practices about marriages and families, policy and political attitudes about family-related issues, and then finally the stability and structure of families themselves. In year 2 of the survey, we repeated the core questions about many of these topics and added a battery of questions about economic experiences in different family units. It also looked at parenting styles, and for the first time, attitudes toward family leave, something that we'll be discussing again today. In year 3, Jeremy and Chris added questions about phone and social media usage, addiction, and the diversity of family experiences. In year 4, we learned that people put much more importance on their identity as a parent or a partner than on their identities involving religion, race, political party, or career. This year, Chris Karpowitz will explain, the survey focused, in addition to the core questions, on how much people know about basic statistics about the family and also about family leave policy. As you can see, the survey is very rich and fills an important gap in our understanding of what makes America tick. Now let me turn the proceedings over to Doug Wilkes of the Deseret News, who will tell us more about the survey.
Thank you, Carlin. Again, I'm Doug Wilkes. I'm the editor of the Deseret News. We're very happy to be here. We love working with the American Enterprise Institute and with Brookings Institution and all our experts. I'm not sure it makes us smarter, but it makes us feel like we are smarter. And that's a nice thing to be a journalist who feels smarter, as long as sometimes we keep our mouths closed. On behalf of my colleague, Boyd Matheson, opinion editor of the Deseret News, and Allison Pond, who works with us at the Deseret News and is the director of our survey from the Deseret News standpoint, I welcome you. I'd also like to welcome and thank Paul Edwards. Paul, wave your hand. Paul Edwards, a former editor of the Deseret News. He started the American Family Survey together with Allison. And that concept we're trying to carry forward. We began with a simple but important premise and principle, and that is that the family is an essential unit of society and vital to its sustainability, growth, and success. We wanted to measure and track family life in all its many forms and partnered with BYU and our experts, now our friends here at AEI and at Brookings, as well as the others on our advisory council that were mentioned and that you'll hear from today. This does mark 5 years for us, and we want to continue going with this. We have seen some very interesting trends. Today, as Carlin noted, we went in depth on American attitudes on family leave. What is interesting is, do we actually care as much about our parents as we do about the babies born? Americans do feel like they need family leave to care for an infant, but with the graying of America, just what can we do to care for our parents? And we went both sort of macro and micro on that concept. What's happening in Congress right now? And those results are quite fascinating, as what our lawmakers want to do doesn't necessarily jive with what our American families say they need. And we hope from that starting point that we can begin a conversation and actually get action on both the government level and the family level to care for our aging parents. We also looked at the myths. Do our beliefs on marriage and on fertility, on teen sexual attitudes, on connectivity, do they match what's actually is happening in the country? And those results were also fascinating. Do we know enough about what is occurring to actually make good policy and to actually have conversations? Sometimes you'll hear, wow, half of all marriages end in divorce. Well, that's not true. Well, if it's not true, what does it mean? And what does it mean about familial trends? We also looked at, given that we are now 5 years into this survey, what has happened over to marriage. Marriage, we find, is still a strong, essential unit of society. People want to be married. However, there seems to be a softening, and we'll talk more about that. And if there is a softening, what does that mean for us in our society? We believe the family is important in all its forms. We want to address reality. We want to be able to talk about these things in a non-political way so that when it enters the political realm, there's good data, good facts, and therefore good policy. I'd like now to turn the time over to Chris Karpowitz. I thank you for coming. You can read the stories that we've done on Deseret.com, and I encourage you to do that. And also to please welcome Chris with a round of applause, and we'll get going. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Carlin. It's wonderful to be back here at AEI and to talk a little bit about the American Family Survey. And I will try to advance my slides. This is our 5th year, as Doug has said, and we are delighted to be able to tell you a little bit about what we've done. I need to thank a couple of additional people in addition to the advisory board and Doug and Allison and Paul, who helped get all of this started. We have a couple of research assistants at BYU, Margaret Jarvis and Alex Bass, who've been quite involved this year. And I also need to thank my partner in crime, Jeremy Pope, who co-directs the Center for the Study of Elections and Democracy with me, and who has fled to London with a group of students. And I've told him that his job is to keep the UK together. He's being only partially successful at that, I think, so far. So let's see. I'm not sure how I can get these slides to come up, because we do want to walk through a little bit of the findings of the study. The American Family Survey is a national level survey that's conducted for us by YouGov. It includes about 3,000 individuals, respondents to the survey. Here we go. That's wonderful. About 3,000 respondents to the survey whose characteristics mirror those of the general population of the United States. And as we've already talked about, we have some core questions each year and then modules that allow us to go in depth on different topics. So in 2019, we had 3 main aims. The first was to examine the 5-year trends in our core questions. The second, to see what Americans really know about trends in family life and whether or not that matters. And third, to evaluate Americans' experiences with family leave and their attitudes about family leave policy. And we'll have more to say about each of those items. You can see that since 2015, there's quite a bit of stability in terms of Americans' relationships. We do see a small decrease in the percentage of Americans who report being married, and a small corresponding increase in the percentage of Americans who say they're not in a relationship at all. And so we think that bears watching. It does seem to be the case that people love their relationships and their families. They care about them. They feel generally pretty positive about their own marriages. That's the panel on the left. We asked people to tell us in the past 2 years, has your own marriage, and later we asked a similar question about their own families, is it staying about the same? Is it getting better, or is it getting worse? And we do find that people think their own marriages are either staying the same or getting stronger over time. But when they turn to marriages generally, people are somewhat more pessimistic. Now, we do see some evidence of a slight decline in that pessimism. The percentage of people who say that marriages generally in the United States are getting weaker has declined a little bit since 2015, and so we think that is a trend that is worth continuing to watch. We also asked people their beliefs about marriage, and again, we find a great deal of stability over time. I want to draw your attention to two places where we see the hints, at least, of some change. One is we asked people to tell us whether they agreed or disagreed that marriage is needed in order to create strong families. And over time, we've seen about an 8-point decrease in the percentage of people who agree with that statement. We also see a small increase in the percentage of people who tell us that marriage is old-fashioned and out of date. That increase in feeling it's old-fashioned and out of date, and the decrease in feeling that marriage is needed in order to create strong families, is found across a wide variety of demographic groups, but it's the biggest among the youngest Americans. And so I think that bears watching again in future years to see, do young people continue to soften in their beliefs about the importance of marriage as a core institution? When it comes to the day-to-day family facts of family life, as Carlin indicated, one of the virtues we think that accompanies this survey is we're asking lots of questions about Americans' day-to-day experiences, what life is like for the American family. And we find that actually in the experiences of day-to-day family life, Republicans and Democrats are pretty similar. And if anything, they've grown more similar over time with respect to things like eating dinner together and doing household chores and attending activities. The one exception to that is worshiping together. Now, we would note that majorities of both Democrats and Republicans say that they don't worship together at least monthly. But that disparity is especially large between Democrats and Republicans. The experience of worshiping together as a family is just much more common for Republicans than for Democrats. Now, that's probably not surprising because Republicans are much more likely to be involved in a religious community than are Democrats. But we also think that this aspect of family life bears watching, in part because the gap between Republicans and Democrats has widened by about 12 points over the course of just the past 5 years. We also asked people what the most important issues facing families are, and we've done this every year for the first 5 years of the survey. We gave respondents to our survey a curated list of 12 things, randomly ordered and not given in categories as we've done here in this slide. But we think they sort of roughly separate into 3 different categories. And over time, what we've seen is increasing concern about the economic pressures on American families and some decreasing concern about broader cultural issues related to families. Now, we note that this worry about economic concern is not really a worry about having jobs or having good jobs. It's more a worry about the cost of family life and the stresses that accompany work for parents. And so we think this is important, that despite the fact that we've been in a period, at least according to many economic indicators, of economic expansion, concern about the economic stresses facing families has increased since 2015. So that's a very quick overview of some of the trends in our core questions. This year, we also focused on what Americans know about the actual facts of family life. And we asked about 7 different demographic trends: the divorce rate, teen sexual activity, the rate of births outside of marriage, teen pregnancy, by which we mean teen births specifically, the fertility rate, the marriage rate, and the rate of the percentage of single-parent homes. And we wanted to see whether Americans really knew these basic demographic trends. We tried to be really generous in what we counted as being a correct answer, and our advisory board was very helpful to us in trying to think about, well, what should we count as correct or incorrect? We've indicated here in this slide what we counted as correct. And you can see that some of those trends may be surprising to you. The divorce rate is actually decreasing. The rates of teen sexual activity and teen births are clearly decreasing, as are births outside of marriage. Unfortunately, many Americans don't know the answers to those questions. They do not know that the divorce rate is declining or rates of teen sex are declining. Overwhelming numbers of Americans get those facts wrong. They are pessimistic on those items where they don't need to be. They're more likely to be correct on the fertility rate and the marriage rate and single-parent homes, answers where the arguably more pessimistic response is the correct answer. So it seems to me, or to Jeremy and me, that part of what we see is a kind of general pessimism about families and family life, even when it is not warranted. That pessimism is common to both Democrats and Republicans, although it's a little more pronounced for Republicans than it is for Democrats. Why does any of this matter? Well, it matters in part because getting those trends of family life wrong is also correlated with a more general pessimism about marriages and families. Recall that we talked about in our core questions this general question of whether marriages and families are getting weaker or not. And what we find is that people who get the answers to our trend questions wrong, particularly those trend questions that are actually not moving in a negative direction, are much more pessimistic about marriages generally and families generally than those who get the answers to those questions right. So knowing some basic facts about what's happening to family life in America matters for your overall summary judgments, or at least those two things are correlated. Don't really know the causal ordering of it, but they are correlated. What was that? There are other response options. Here we're just looking at whether people responded that families are getting weaker. They could also respond that families are getting stronger or that families are staying the same. That's why they don't add up to 100. Great question. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about before turning this over to the other members of our panel is family leave. We asked people both their experiences about family leave and their attitudes about family leave policy. And it turns out that about 15% of Americans, in terms of our sample total, had taken leave a leave of a week or more sometime in the past 5 years. When we restrict that to people who are in the workforce and for whom leave was actually applicable, it's about 1 in 5 Americans had taken a week off or more for family-related reasons. That's true of both men and women. The most common type of leave, when we ask those who had taken leave what type of leave they took, the most common type is maternity leave for women, and it's paternity leave for men, though other types of leave are also common. We find that people of all different demographic characteristics take leave. That's true. It's true of Republicans and Democrats and young people and older people, maybe a little more common among younger people than older people. It's also true across income categories. Here we've separated into 3 basic income categories, and we see that rates of taking family leave, that's the set of bars to the far left, are pretty even across those income categories. What's not equal across those income categories is the actual experience of the leave itself. So though they take leave at similar rates, the experience during that leave is quite different. Those at the lowest income levels are much less likely than those at higher income levels to receive pay during their leave from their employer. If they receive pay from their employer, they're also likely to receive a lower percentage of their typical income than those at higher levels of income. And they are also likely to face increased obstacles to getting back to the same job that they had to begin with. That is, they're less likely to go back to the same job at the same company that they held at the beginning of the leave. In fact, they're much more likely to leave the workforce entirely than those at the higher end of the income scale. So though the prevalence of leave is common, across those income categories, the actual experience of leave is quite different. And so when we ask people, well, how did you fund your leave? Regardless of how much income you brought in, how did you fund that leave? We see that wealthy and poor Americans fund their leaves in different ways, right? The wealthier Americans receive a higher percentage of their overall leave income from their employer, and a lower percentage from family and friends than those at the lowest levels of income. Then finally, we turn to the question of family leave policy more generally. And we asked about family leave in a couple of different ways, and it turns out how you ask the question matters. One way we asked this question was to ask, well, who should be responsible for covering the cost of family leave? And here it turns out, and people could tell us, well, we want the government or employers, or that should be covered themselves. And they could also check more than one, right? So they could give us some combination. And what we've given here is just the percentage of people who choose each of those categories. You can see that there is agreement among a majority of Democrats and Republicans that employers should cover maternity leave. But after that, agreement breaks down in terms of whether government or the employer should cover that leave. And there's more of a sense that people should fund at least some of that leave themselves. In fact, if there's agreement about anything, it's that with respect to these other types of family-related leave, people should be willing to cover at least some of the costs themselves. We also asked this question in a slightly different way. We asked, well, if Congress were to pass paid family leave, we didn't specify whether the employer would cover that pay or the government, who should be eligible for it? And here, unlike with our previous results on the experience of family leave, here there are some important partisan differences. And you can see that Democrats are just much more enthusiastic about making paid leave eligible in a wider variety of circumstances than are Republicans. But both majorities of Republicans and Democrats believe that paid leave in the context of maternity leave would be important. They also differ in terms of the length, the preferred length of leave. When we ask people how long their actual leaves were, the median for men was about 2 weeks, and the median for women was about a month. There are important partisan differences in their preferred length of leave, but generally both Republicans and Democrats believe that leaves for caring for sick children or for adult family members or for maternity and paternity leave should be longer than leaves taken to care for friends or for other sorts of reasons. Finally, we asked about 4 different leave policies that are currently being debated here in Washington, D.C. I'm not going to go through the details of those policies, and in fact, Aparna will be able to talk much more about them. The one thing I want you to see is that none of these policies currently have the support of a majority of Americans. And I think there are some good reasons for that, right? Public conversation and dialogue about these particular bills has not really coalesced yet, and hasn't really taken center stage in our public discourse yet. And so I think there's room here for lots of movement. In fact, 2 Republican-sponsored bills are more popular among Democrats than among Republicans. And there's just none of these bills yet have the support of most Americans. And so I think there's work to do to educate the public and to help them see the advantages and disadvantages of each of these items. Finally, we asked, well, if the government were to mandate paid leave, right? Government-funded paid leave in some way, how should the government pay for it? Here, again, there's not really much consensus around any idea of a much bigger government program to provide paid leave, or some new entitlement program, or altering existing entitlement programs to pay for family leave. To the extent that there is agreement among Republicans and Democrats, it is around the notion that the government might provide tax incentives for employers to provide paid leave. So again, that's very different than some sort of large new entitlement program. So what have we seen this year? Well, we've seen a variety of, we think, interesting and important ideas that give us a great deal to talk about in terms of the core questions of family life. We see a great deal of stability, but some hints of change that are worth talking about more. We see pessimism about trends in family life that isn't warranted and that matters for their overall summary judgments about the American family. We see that family leave is a common experience for many Americans, but it differs. The details of that experience differ across income levels. And we see that people are just beginning to think about family leave policy, and so there's a great deal of space for additional learning and more to talk about with respect to family leave. We think there's a great deal to talk about with respect to all of these findings, and we look forward to the panel today and to your comments and questions. I think Brad is next, so thank you.
Well, the panel's coming up. I want to say a special thank you to Jackie Clements, our wonderful research assistant, who helped me organize all of this and has kept everything moving this morning. We're going to turn to Brad Wilcox first, and I think, Chris, you've given us a wonderful summary introduction to this very full survey, which will be available on the Deseret News site and also on the BYU site. So you can look at the questions we asked, see how we phrase them, and decide how you assess what Americans have said in response. Brad. Each of our panelists will speak for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Carlin. I wanted to say, by way of beginning here, that I think the American Family Survey gives us new insights into the marriage divide in America. We've all, I think, been paying attention to that divide, in our research and our writing, both in the academy and in the media and the public square more generally. But if you look closely at the numbers in this new survey, what you see in these new numbers is that a majority of college-educated Americans, a majority of more affluent Americans, a majority of Republicans, and a majority of more religious Americans are married in the U.S. And by contrast, what we see is that Americans who aren't affluent, who aren't college-educated, who are not Republicans, and who are not religious, most of them are not married. So again, this is kind of giving us some sense of this marriage divide playing out in the United States today. And here, I want to sort of think about we've been I think we understand how this marriage divide is linked to questions of economic inequality. It's linked to questions of opportunity. for our kids in the US. But I wanted to sort of just using data from the survey actually itself to think about how it could also be linked to reports of happiness with life in general. And what this new survey tells us, and I've looked at this data with my colleague Wendy Wang at the Institute for Family Studies, is the following. If you look at this slide here, what we can see is that in this particular survey, that Republicans, that more affluent Americans, that Americans who are attending church, and that married Americans are more likely to say that they are completely satisfied with life. And so as I was kind of looking at this data, I also wanted to sort of figure out, well, how much of the story for those who are more affluent, for those who are Republicans, and for those who are attending church is about this marriage divide, again, it's playing out in our country. And it turns out that about 30% of the story for affluence and life satisfaction, about 30% of the story for Republicans when it comes to life satisfaction is about the fact that they're more likely to be married. And when it comes to kind of the religion story, about just 15% of that story is related to the fact that they're also more likely to be married. So again, what I'm kind of getting at here is that as we kind of think about this marriage divide in America, we need to recognize how it's linked not just to sort of economic questions that tend to kind of preoccupy us, but also kind of questions about sort of happiness, meaning, satisfaction in life. And what this new survey and this new data set suggests to us is that people who are more affluent, people who are Republican especially, are doing perhaps better in life when it comes to sort of their satisfaction, their happiness, their well-being, emotional well-being, because they're also more likely to be married. And then let me just conclude by saying, I think the paradox, though, right, is that, and this speaks to some of Chris's earlier comments this morning, is that at least when it comes to sort of the partisanship story, the paradox here, right, is that they're also more pessimistic about the family in general, right? So it's sort of this weird thing where on the one hand, their sense of sort of where the family is headed in the US, in general, is more negative, more pessimistic. But on the other hand, they're more likely to report, satisfaction with their own lives. And what I'm wondering here, and I think we need to sort of look at the data in more detail, is sort of, is there a way in which a sense of concern or a sense of pessimism with the family in general, sort of out there, is linked on the part of at least some Americans with a greater desire to invest in their own marriages and their own families on the one hand, but also perhaps a greater willingness to reject some of the more fashionable nostrums out there when it comes to our thinking about marriage and family life, and to instead subscribe to a more traditional or more marriage-centered perspective that then again makes them more likely to marry in the first place, more likely to stay married in the second place, and finally more likely to be enjoying relatively high-quality marriages in the third place because of their distinctive commitment to marriage. So that's what I had to say for our opening conversation here.
Great, thank you so much. It's a delight to be here. Congratulations to the authors on this great survey, and it's just a pleasure to be part of this project. I'd like to say a couple things, and I think emphasizing maybe a bit less the focus on marriage of what Brad was saying, but by contrast, thinking about really a lot of consensus about families in American life. And I think starting first with thinking about these really interesting findings about parental leave. First, it seems that Americans, by and large, want new parents to have time off with their babies. And this transcends party lines, at least with respect to maternity leave, right? The majority of both Democrats and Republicans want mothers to be able to have some time off with their kids, and a non-trivial number of even Republicans want dads to have time off with their kids. And these are substantial lengths of time. When you look, or when people are asked how long that should be, it ranges from 2 months to 4.5 months across Republicans and Democrats for moms, and 1 month to 3.5 months for dads. And I think this really points to, as we have sort of moved on with a lot more women entering the labor force, men and women are now sharing both work and want to share child rearing, right? And in many ways are sharing child rearing. And I think this is good. This is good for kids. There's a lot of evidence that fathers' involvement is good for children. Mothers are intrinsically involved with children, and there's a lot of evidence about family stability and engagement as being very positive for children's well-being. And it's also good for gender equality, right? As Sarah McClanahan, a famous sociologist who's also part of the advisory panel, once said, it's hard to see how men and women can be truly equal unless they share responsibility for child rearing. And I think that's where a lot of Americans want things to go. But they don't want to pay for it, right? When we look at the data about the cost of it, there's not a lot of support for new taxes, right? Understandably, no one wants to have a chunk taken out of their paycheck. And yet, as the famous quote in front of the IRS says, the price, how's it go? The price for taxes are the price we pay for civilization, right? And if we value this time with children, we are going to have to pay for it in some form or another. And I think we're just beginning these policy conversations of what that's going to look like. But I think it's a real chance for Americans to think about valuing families, that there will then need to be some investment along those lines. At the same time, for low-income parents, it's a really different story. So you look at low-income parents taking leave. Some of them do take leave, but many of them don't go back to the same job they were in before the leave. So what kind of a leave is that when you're really transitioning employment situations? And then many people that rely on some government support rely on food stamps, which is not at all designed to be parental leave. That's about basic food and nutrition, right? So thinking about the opportunities out there for low-income families, I think, is really important as we move forward. And I think this points to a broader gap by socioeconomic status, some of which Brad talked about, right? We're having really different experiences as Americans for those who have resources and education and those who don't. And again, if we sort of want all people to be able to achieve their family objectives, this is something to think about, right? And it's an opportunity for, I think, consensus given the shared values. I was struck by, in Chris's comments, the fact that in the report, Republicans and Democrats actually do quite similar things with their families, right? The one difference being religion, worshiping together. So Republicans are a little bit more likely, or quite a bit more likely, about 20 percentage points to worship together. Democrats are a little bit more likely to go to a movie or other social event. But if we look at the rest of it, there's a lot of similarity in terms of how people navigate family life. And again, I see this as a real opportunity in a time of sort of partisan polarization to think about families as a unifying institution. There's quite a bit of stability when you look across time in family patterns and values and beliefs. And I think that that then sort of helps us think about what does it mean to really invest in families in the US. So instead of, for me, taking a sort of a divisive perspective or sort of thinking about divides, I think there's a real opportunity here for cohesiveness and valuing families across the political divide and sort of thinking about what does that mean in terms of opportunities for people that want to have stable families in the context of the current economy and political context. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Next, Parna and I have agreed we're going to deliver our remarks from the stage, if that's okay. I'm just following Aparna's lead. Let me add my thanks to the survey team. I once accused the British philosopher Quentin Skinner of being a pessimist. And he said, no, I'm not a pessimist. A pessimist is someone who thinks the world is going to go to hell. I think we've already gone to hell. And actually, I was reminded of that quote when I was reading the survey. I want to address my remarks to the striking findings about the gap between the reality and the perception around some of these issues, and what you might think of as a sort of culture of pessimism, now I am using the term loosely, that is revealed in this survey. Very, very striking, particularly on teen sex, teen pregnancy, and divorce rate. Where you see these really very, very big gaps. And I'm going to just speculate as to why that might matter a bit, whose fault it is, to start with, and then why that might matter a little bit. And in terms of whose fault it is, I think one answer to that might be it's a little bit our fault. It's a little bit the community of scholars, policymakers, journalists, etc., and some politicians too. And you notice now that in our politics generally, the sense that we are going to hell in a handcart. You don't say handcart here, do you? What's the phrase? Handbasket, thank you. I always forget. Going to hell in a handbasket is shared across the political spectrum now. It's just the particular basket that we disagree about. And so you have a president who uses his inaugural to talk about American carnage. We have leading Democrats who describe levels of inequality and poverty not seen for a century. We're living in an oligarchic society, etc. And so whilst they profoundly disagree with each other about what is so badly wrong, they agree that things are very badly wrong. And then that then actually kind of communicates itself in various ways, I think, through society. And then I think we can sometimes add to that ourselves, sometimes in the work that we do. And it's something that I'm struggling with a lot, candidly, in my own work. How do you strike that balance? So why would it be that politicians or policymakers or scholars or people who are writing about this, why would they be gloomier perhaps themselves, and that might then be reflected in public opinion? Why might they? Because they are sometimes. We can't just say, oh, look at all these people who don't know, when they're being constantly told how terrible things are by the media, by politics, and so on. And I think there's one good reason why people might be gloomier than the facts would suggest, and two bad reasons. The one good reason is to try and motivate an improvement. After all, if you're trying to persuade people we need solutions, then you need some problems. And so you're going to articulate those problems. You might sometimes exaggerate those problems in order to try and motivate action. So you exaggerate the problem of poverty to try and get more action on anti-poverty, or whatever the equivalent might be. And so you might say, okay, that's not a terrible motivation, although even then you need to be careful. I think there's a couple of bad reasons. One is to get attention. Is that actually in a crowded space, and particularly now with the rise of social media and so on, is that actually there's a bit of a race to hyperbole. And that in order to get on the show, in order to get covered, in order to get the column, in order to get cut through, that actually it needs to be a hyperbolic statement. Saying that divorce trends are going down modestly is not a very exciting story. To say that American families are in crisis, falling to pieces is a story. But the other reason that I think, and comes a bit closer to home, that I think some of us who work in this space might do it, and perhaps some policymakers, is that it makes you seem cleverer. If you're negative about the world, then you're probably clever. There's something that seems a little bit dumb about saying that things are probably okay. Only a stupid person would say that. It takes very clever people to identify the profound problems of society. In fact, my own hero, John Stuart Mill, once said, if you want to be thought well of as an intellectual, you must think ill of the world. You must think ill of the world. And actually, thinking ill of the world is one of the things that gets you book deals and articles and attention and Twitter followers. Why does that matter? Why does any of this matter? Maybe it doesn't. After all, whatever it is, percentage think Elvis is still alive, or aliens are coming, or whatever. And it's easy to sort of have some fun with those things. But I actually start to worry now that this sense of irrational levels of pessimism or negativity about the world might actually matter substantively. But it might start to matter for behavior, and it might start to matter for motivation. And I think it might happen in a few ways. First of all, economically, if you start to get the view that capitalism is completely shattered, that no one's getting better off, everything's terrible economically, it's massive insecurity, then why on earth would you risk moving towns for a different job? Why would you spend such money on college if you didn't think you were going to get the earnings to kind of pay off? Why would you try and start a business? So maybe one of the reasons why we've seen a halving of business startups, a halving of the number of people crossing state lines, et cetera, is because of this kind of sense that maybe things aren't going to be so great. Capitalism depends fundamentally on the idea that the future will be better. And it will be better as a result of our own efforts. That's why you invest. That's why you take risks. In fact, capitalism invented the idea of the future, in my view. And it's profoundly future-oriented. And the biggest enemy of capitalism is not socialism. It's pessimism. Because if people stop believing in the predictability of a better future, they will stop doing the things that will deliver that better future in a potentially vicious cycle. It might matter for social decisions. If you think that half of all marriages end in divorce, you're going to get married? Maybe not, actually. Or you're going to think twice about it, or you're going to be much more kind of reluctant about it. And so it might start to affect some of those social decisions too. So I think it might matter for the economic decisions people make, and it might matter for the social decisions. But also think here, and I will address my comments more to perhaps people on the political left and on the right, is that if we really do think that despite all of this government spending and all of the things that government's done around social security and anti-poverty and so on, that we're in a society where, to quote Bernie Sanders from last night, we have the highest levels of child poverty in the world, then you might reasonably say, well, why are we spending all that money then, Bernie? Right? I thought we'd done all these good things. And in fact, Social Security takes the poverty rate among the elderly down from 40% to 10%. I consider that to be a reasonable success. We can argue about Social Security, but actually so both left and right end up actually undermining the idea that sensible, even if incremental, public policy can actually make life somewhat better. The world doesn't have to be falling apart, and the solutions don't have to be ones that will completely turn the earth on its axis in order for us to get that support. So in the long run, it might undermine support for public policy. So my real question is, who are the optimists now? And maybe some of us need to do a better job of being a bit more optimistic.
So on the note of optimism, I do think, and I want to congratulate Chris and Doug for actually doing the survey, including a paid family leave component, because I am optimistic about getting some policy on paid family leave at a time when there seems to be this big divide in Congress between Republicans and Democrats to move forward on anything. I think the one area where we are seeing a coming together, not in terms of design, not in terms of details, not in terms of what we think of as the sort of the nuances of a policy, but on the fundamental idea that families need paid family leave. And I think that's what this survey shows. It could be, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences between Republicans and Democrats on the policy. But I think the big central message of the survey, and I hope we can do this every year, because this is an issue that's getting a lot of traction, as Marcy pointed out. It's a fundamental economic issue for working families. It's not a divide when you talk to voters, do you need paid family leave? There isn't that big divide on whether we need it. The question is, what sort of policy can we get in Congress? So I think the more surveys we have coming out from organizations like BYU and Deseret, the better sense we will have of, how do we do this? This is something that affects every family across the country. How do we move forward on it? I think there are a few striking findings from the survey that really stand out, and I've been working on paid family leave now for several years, along with Isabel Sawhill at Brookings, and Richard is part of our group as well. We tend to think about paid family leave as a component of many different policies. So we often tend to club together things like paid parental leave, paid medical leave, paid caregiving leave. And I think one reason for that is that when you look at the Unpaid Family and Medical Leave Act that passed in 1993, we tended to include all three types of leave together. And we said, and so it seemed like a natural transition to say, well, let's move from, the unpaid FMLA to a paid FMLA, and, all our problems would be solved. And I think what this survey is showing us is that there is a ton of uneven support for the different components of paid family leave. And this was a big discussion within our AI Brookings working group, where we found that people generally tended to support the need for parental leave. In fact, our first year report we dedicated entirely to parental leave, because both sides, and we had people with ideologically different perspectives, came together and said, absolutely, parental leave is sort of the biggest reason to move forward with paid family leave policies. And we see that in the data. And then when we moved on to caregiving, there was a ton of confusion. Well, what does that leave look like? Do we just say, 8 weeks of parental leave is the same as 8 weeks of caregiving leave? Should we just sort of incorporate that, have a uniform policy on all three types of leave taking? And there was a ton of disagreement. And it's interesting to me that we see that disagreement even in the survey that you present. So there is, both Republicans and Democrats support maternity leave, and there is also a ton of support for paternity leave. Not as much for maternity, not as much as it is for maternity leave. But when you look at the caregiving leave, Republican support for caregiving leave dips to something below 40%. Democrats are still strongly supportive of caregiving leave, And that's why I think when you look at the two, the proposals that are coming out from Democrats and Republicans, you see that divide there. Republicans have tended to focus on policies that only cover paid parental leave. Democrats have tended to focus on policies that cover all three types of leave. And it's interesting to me that that is reflected in the survey data amongst how Democrats view paid family leave provision and how Republicans view paid family leave provisions. In terms of the duration of leave, I think it's striking, and Marcy pointed that out as well. We tend to think that Republicans do not support generous leave policies. And by generous, I think of 8 weeks or 2 months. A lot of people here would think of 6 months and 1 year. But in practical terms, I think a lot of the conversation has been, well, should we do 4 weeks or 6 weeks, or 8 weeks is really stretching it. But what the survey shows is that Republicans are happy to support 2 months of paid maternity leave and over 1.5 months of paid paternity leave. So for both moms and dads, you can achieve a compromise that is well over 4 weeks and slightly less than 2 months. And I think that's interesting. That's worth pointing out, to policymakers in Congress, that both sides actually do strongly support extended durations of leave for both moms and dads. When it comes to caregiving, again, Republican support for caregivers, for when you talk about sick children and adult family caregivers, again, the support is about 2 months. You can do 2 months of caregiving leave even when you talk to Republican voters. Of course, for Democrats, all of these numbers are nearly doubles, and that's how we perceive, Democrats view these policies. So it is striking to me that there is a compromise here that's worth. That would sort of get us to something that's 8 weeks or 2 months, and that both sides can agree upon. Again, when you look at the pay-fors, a surprising majority of Republicans and Democrats say employers need to be providing maternity and paternity leave. This is over 50% say employers need to be doing that. Now, again, when you talk to Republican policymakers, they always feel, well, if businesses want to do it, they'll do it. The free market will dictate who gets paid leave. If businesses value their employees, they're going to do it. And so when I look at that response, I feel like when Republicans look at that question, they think, well, this is a natural outgrowth of markets. Yes, employers should do it, but we're not going to force them to do it. But when Democrats look at that question, they say, well, it's the employer's responsibility, and we can do it via mandate, we can do it via tax. But that's why employers need to do it. And this is also what the Pew survey had shown earlier, that a lot of people feel that these kind of paid leave policies need to be paid for by employers. But it's not clear to me what that means. Does that mean an employer mandate? Does that mean a tax? Does that mean we expect employers to naturally want to provide these policies? In terms of who gets paid leave, I think that reflects very closely everything. So I'm supposed to stop. I'll take 1 extra minute. Reflects very closely what we see in other FMLA data. Low-income workers are the least likely to get leave. They have much lower replacement rates. They are much more likely to drop out of the workforce altogether if they don't have access to paid leave. So all of that, is very much in line with what we knew before. I think what's interesting about the survey is that it shows that a lot of low-income households are relying on food stamps to get by when they need paid leave. They're not relying on their employers. They're relying largely on their own savings, and they're relying on government transfer programs like food stamps. And again, that's not how we want to do paid leave in this country. We need to figure out a way to improve access to the most vulnerable workers, to these low-wage workers, and we need to figure out how to do it in a way that's also not too costly for businesses. And I'll end with this sort of divide on recent legislation. So it's striking to me, when you look at proposals that talk about, well, we can provide paid leave by letting people pull forward Social Security benefits, which is the Ernst & Lee plan and the Rubio plan and so on. And there was a massive outrage that why would we let people pull forward Social Security benefits? That's dipping into their retirement security. And what we find in the survey is a big chunk of Democrats actually support the Social Security idea, and a big chunk of Republicans support the Family Act. It's not clear that we're dividing along party lines. The federal proposals that are divided along party lines. I think that's interesting for policymakers to take into account as well, that when you actually talk to people, and it could be that it's the voluntary aspect of some of these proposals. So as you also show in the survey, when people rank what's the most popular way to do paid leave, people say, well, tax-free savings accounts or even Senator Fisher's employer tax credits are at the top of the list, and then the lowest are taxes on actual people. And I think what a lot of people are actually saying is that you should have voluntary programs because a lot of us can actually afford to do paid leave ourselves. So I think there are interesting nuances to what you found in the survey that a lot of policymakers should heed.
Thank you to all of our panelists for being so remarkably disciplined. We want to leave time for your questions, but first I'd like to ask Chris if he'd like to respond to what he's heard and perhaps tell us a little more about some of the findings in the survey that relate to what our panelists have said.
Thanks, Carlin. Well, thank you to all the panelists. This is really wonderful for us. We've been combing through the survey, and so it's really helpful to hear your reactions to it. I guess I'll begin with what Aparna said, and I really agree with this. I think there's space here for some very interesting conversations, and I think this connects to what Marcy said as well, that some very interesting conversations about how we value families together as a society and how we want to provide for families in the case of family leave. And because opinion hasn't really coalesced or hasn't really polarized on these issues, I think that there's opportunity here, and so I hope that we'll continue this conversation because I do think there's important opportunities. And I think then the other thing that I'll say just really briefly, because I want to have the conversation, is I do think there's more to say about optimism and pessimism. And this sort of gets at what both Brad and Richard said, that there is reason for optimism about families and family life. People love their families. They love their partners. They want those relationships to succeed. And they value them, we found last year, they value those identities more than all the other identities that we spend so much more time talking about, our political identities and other identities that are discussed quite a bit in American society today. But we don't have this conversation in quite the same way about families and those family identities. And because we value them, and because we think caregiving is important, then I think it gives us this opportunity to talk about a public policy issue like family leave in ways that might cut across the typical, very polarized boundaries. At least that's my optimistic hope. So.
Any other comments by the panelists before we turn to questions?
Just
Brad.
one. In response to Richard. I think it's important for us to sort of hold these two sort of different ideas in tension, right? That there are kind of, in a sense, that these two nations out there. And for those Americans who are kind of marrying today, yeah, they're going to enjoy more stable marriages and relatively high-quality ones. I mean, about 65% of those who are married, they said they're very happy in their marriages. So most of the time today, those who marry will stay married, and they're generally pretty happy in their marriages. And that's a wonderful thing. That's a great thing. We also have to hold the other idea in our heads at the same time, and that is that fewer and fewer Americans are going to ever marry. So Stephen Martin at the Urban Institute estimates about 70% of young adults today will ever marry. That's a record low, at least in recent years. And the other thing we're seeing, of course, too, is a record low in our fertility rate in the United States. And we're seeing fertility falling across the West. I just saw this morning they're looking at this issue in the Nordics, where they have wonderful family and work policies, dramatic declines in fertility. So Finland is at about 1.4 right now, almost in Japan territory. So the question that I have in my head, too, is just recognizing that more and more Americans going forward will not have access to a spouse and maybe not even either a child or the number of kids that they would like to have. And I see more and more Americans kind of in a situation that's been described in China as kind of the bare branches situation, where there's not a spouse there for them, maybe no kids there for them, or just one child. And as they move into older age, for a lot of these folks, it's going to be a pretty profoundly lonely period in life. And again, of course, this is much more likely to be happening to Americans who are in the working class or who are poor. So we have to hold in tension these two different patterns. For those who are kind of forming families today, particularly in marriage, there's some great news out there. But there are lots of Americans today, particularly those who are poor, working class, and frankly also more secular, who are less likely to marry, and I think today also less likely to have kids in ways that will affect them in midlife, especially, I think, in later life.
Other comments by the panel, and now we'll turn to your questions. And if you could identify yourself and wait for the microphone should be coming right away.
Oh, hi. My name is Carl Polzer, and I'm an irritant at a lot of these great discussions, and I think the survey and the work that the committee did really shed a lot of light on these issues. I started a project called the Center on Capital and Social Equity 4 years ago to explore the dynamics of inequality, but unlike focusing on the 1% or the middle, where I advocate is for the bottom. And I think this issue is really a good example, and I wrote about this in Health Affairs early in January, where the middle class interests are driving the issue, and the bottom is, workers at the bottom are really in quite great danger of losing out. And here's the reason. So think about how they're paying, like if we do a payroll tax, that's a regressive tax. That's for the middle class. 8 weeks is a big lift for the employer. What happened with the previous unpaid leave? The small employers go up to the hill, they have a lot of power, and they got carved out. That's where a lot of the crummy jobs are. So it's pretty likely that the small, the little guy, 40% of the births are paid for by Medicaid. Okay, so the poor people we're depending on these poor people to support Social Security with their fertility rate, which is another story.
And your question?
Well, I just
Good,
think we
yeah.
need to consider, okay, I have another question is,
Okay.
wouldn't paid sick days be a better deal for the poor people, okay? A large part of the low-wage population doesn't get paid sick days, but of course the advocates, that's not their primary issue because they're focused on the middle class. So if they could get paid sick, if the people in the nursing homes or in Panera and they could get paid sick days, at least they could accumulate 5 a year.
Yeah.
And maybe we can give them some more if they had a baby.
Yeah.
So wouldn't that be
Aparna?
a better approach? Sorry,
Yeah.
I have to give some
That's all right.
background.
That's all right, I understand.
I-
For the poor people.
Yeah.
No, that's a great question. And in fact, we are sort of in this round of the working group are looking into how we could talk about expanding sick days. How are people actually functioning now? How are they making ends meet? And a lot of it is reliance on sick days and vacation days, which you're absolutely right, are still not accessible to the lowest wage workers. So doing sick days is a start. But again, it's a very limited number of days, as you said, 5 to 7 days a year that people can accumulate. So to us, if you encounter a medical issue that's longer, you need something like a paid family and medical leave policy. And so, yes, those conversations are intrinsically a part of, this longer conversation on paid leave. And what we also highlight in our report is, of course, there's the cost issue. You could do it through a payroll tax, but you're right, that has impacts on the lowest wage workers. But it is a problem because it is those workers that are the most likely to be left out of these policies. Whether you look at the unpaid FMLA, it's because workers are at small businesses and they don't have access to unpaid job-protected leave, or their employers are not providing them the paid leave. So absolutely, that is the biggest sort of motivation for working on this for us.
We have a question in the back.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Menachem Wecker. I'm a journalist here in DC. It strikes me that there's a lot of reasons that one could support paid parental leave. One could approach it from the perspective, this is the best thing for the infant. One could say this is the best thing for the parents. One could say this is something we want to incentivize on a national level for demographic or economic reasons or for moral reasons we want. What, if anything, does this data tell us about why people are supporting paid parental leave, and does the optimism and pessimism maybe relate to some of the reasons underpinning the support rather than just whether people support it or not? Thank you.
Chris?
We didn't, and this is a great question. We didn't follow up to say, what are the reasons why you're supporting this or that particular policy choice. So I don't think we know, I don't think I can directly answer that question. I think there are some clues, however, right? So we certainly find, right, that paid leave, as we've been talking about, bears unequally hard on the lowest income. We also find, and this relates to the previous question as well, that individuals didn't want to distinguish family leave from other kinds of leave in the ways that we were encouraging them to do. So at one point in the survey, we said, now we're going to ask you about family leave, and here's what we mean by family leave, right? And then we asked them, have you taken family leave? And they could tell us what kind of leave it was, and there was an other category. And a significant percentage of people chose the other category as well. And when we looked at the open-endeds, because we then asked them what's in that other category, a lot of it is a category we didn't ask about, which was care for a family after a death in the family. So there were a significant number of people who said that. But then there was another smaller group of people who said, I just needed a break. I needed a mental health break, or I was having trouble. And we had tried to say, well, that's different from the family leave that we're talking about. But despite our best efforts, some respondents at least conflated those things. And that suggests to me that there are a number of people who aren't really thinking of this in terms of separate bins, but rather in terms of, here are some things I need to do well in my role as a parent. And that might be caring for kids, but it might also be self-care sometimes as well. I realize that's an incomplete answer to your question.
I think the clue is mainly, when you asked about what kinds of leaves what did you take, or what would you have taken if you had access to paid leave? And within the 10% who said we had no access to paid leave, but we would have taken it, it was for parental leave, it was for caregiving reasons. Medical leave was, oddly missing from the survey questions, which we typically think of as, being part of a paid family and medical leave policy. I think that would have been a big part of it. So it does tend to be for precisely the reasons we think about, which is, we have caregiving needs at home, we just had a baby, all of those reasons. So I think people interpreted the question the right way and answered accordingly.
Can I add one speculation?
Sure, of course.
We don't know why the support is there, but the noun parent became a verb, parenting, in the early 1970s, and then became pretty popular. And I think that does reflect a growing recognition of the importance of parents, especially in the very early period. And so I think that the idea that it kind of didn't matter whether it was mum or dad or someone very close looking after kids and talking to them and attaching to them and so on. I think there's just a growing recognition of the importance of that. And so that's wild speculation. We can't attach it to this survey. But I think as parenting and the role of parents has been seen more important, then that creates the sort of foundation for more support for something like paid leave rather than some of the other potential reasons.
Marcy?
I think just to add one fundamental change, I think, since the 60s and 70s is that now both parents are likely to be in the workforce, right? So you had mothers primarily staying home and dads primarily working. You didn't worry as much about a paid parental leave program, right? And now you have two parents, if they're in the same household, likely to both be working, and you have a kid, and who's supposed to take care of that child? So it seems to me sort of integrating these roles of worker and parent is really helpful when we allow people to have the space and time and resources to do both of them.
And it is striking, like when you asked families, what was the biggest challenge you faced? Well, after disciplining children or whatever, it was the cost of raising a family.
That's right.
That superseded, 90% of the other stuff.
People do feel the economic pinch of the cost of raising a family, and they do think that this is that leave to take care of these responsibilities is important because even the low-income group, right, takes the leave at similar rates to the high-income group. And they cobble it together. It's hard, right? They have to take out of their own savings. They borrow from family. They rely on government programs in ways that aren't all that healthy, right? But they do it because it's an important need.
question up in the front. We have quite a few more questions, and we want to get them all in before 11:15. And we'll take a few questions, and we'll put yours on the table and also the woman in back of you. So please ask your questions.
Thank you very much. Dave Clayton. To Dr. Wilcox's point, this decade's verb may be adulting. We're moving from parent to parenting and adults to adulting. I'm just curious if there are things you think would be helpful for this discussion to understand about the effects of relationship status. We saw partisan differences and other sort of identities, but what are those main effects for the life experience of individuals?
And let's also get your question too, right in back. And then you can, whoever on the panel would like to answer this question would be fine. Go ahead.
Perfect. Hi, Megan Boynton, Cronkite News at Arizona PBS. I was curious as to whether any of you have thoughts on what possible causes are driving millennials and Gen Zers away from marriage.
Big questions. Who wants to take a stab at them?
I've got to go. Responding partly to Brad as well as the last two questions, which is there is a balance to be struck here between recognizing that there are these divisions in marriage, but that still it's overwhelming, it's something people want to do, and in the US something that they do. A lot of this, we don't yet know what the completed marriage rates or fertility rates will be. A lot of this is based on projections, and it's, as someone once said, it's very hard to predict, especially the future. And so actually, I don't think we should be too quick to just assume that because you see these attitudes and so on, that the outlook for marriage is quite as gloomy as sometimes I think we're wont to do. I actually read the evidence quite differently. I actually think it's, to me, given the extraordinary change in gender roles and the incredible economic power that women now have compared to men, compared to what they had before, nobody was predicting that marriage would be in such good shape today. In fact, if you read the sociology of the 1970s, the prediction was, well, marriage is just going to become a thing we don't. That's not what's happened. And I think it's for some of the reasons that we've talked about up here. And so, this might be kind of an odd sort of division of labor ideologically and so on. But I just think it's way too early to think that millennials aren't interested in marriage. I think the majority of millennials want to get married. They will get married. Whether they stay married, how good that marriage is a different question. So we shouldn't really, we should be honest about it. Of course we should present the data, but I've done this myself. I think we can overstate the retreat from marriage and overstate the problems of the American family in a way that I think might inadvertently contribute to a narrative that ends up slightly weakening the American family. That's my only concern.
And Chris, your answer to the first question?
There are important main effects of relationship status, and we've focused on those in previous years, but it turns out that being married is just a lot more stable in a whole variety of ways, right? And that cohabiting is often seen as a sort of way station toward marriage, but it's actually quite a bit less stable than maybe many, to get to the second question, millennials and Gen Zs assume.
And just one quick add-on here. I think the fact that marriage is much more common and much more stable among those with a college education and higher income shows that marriage really is a choice that people want, right? Because exactly the people that can afford not to get married and sort of do family in other ways are the ones choosing this institution.
Yeah,
that's exactly right.
But I do think that sort of the cultural piece, even in this survey that you all released, this week, does suggest among younger adults a certain softening or a certain increase in the share of young adults who sort of see it as an out-of-date institution. So we're not yet kind of on the European view that you would see, in Norway or in Sweden or in France to some extent when it comes to marriage among younger adults. But there's certainly some indication, even in this survey, that for some share of millennials and for Gen Zers, their commitment, their affiliation with their orientation towards marriage is weaker. And I would say that other things being equal, that will probably lead to less marriage for those who have that cultural orientation. And you kind of add on to that these sort of other economic challenges that we're sort of talking about today as well that face working class and poor Americans, just kind of build on Marcy's comment in more profound ways, suggest too that that's the class piece will also be playing out too.
Well, I will place a bet that we'll never be able to see who's a winner on this because it would require a time machine. If we went back to the 1960s or early 1970s and asked the same age group whether they thought marriage was out of date, I don't think the numbers will be that different.
Yeah.
I really don't. You get these moves and you get this age. My sense is that if you ask the equivalent age group in the 60s and 70s, do you think marriage is an out-of-date institution?
Sure.
You might find higher numbers, and yet They all went on to get married.
Good. Let's put two final questions, these two in the center table, and we'll put these on the table, and then unfortunately, we're going to have to shut this off, but I know our panelists will stay to answer your questions, so please, go ahead, question.
I just had
quickly.
the impression from a couple of these numbers that a lot of Americans have certain social conservative biases that nobody I know in the policy community, either center left or center right, has. And so I'm just wondering about this. First of all, to push back against something Richard was saying, this perception of decline question, it could be that Americans are misperceiving it, or it could just be that they have a wider time frame than we social science researchers do. We all know that teen pregnancies are down since the 90s. Maybe they're comparing it to the 60s. And so they could just, they're presupposing that they want to compare this to their parents' generation, and so they're actually right that there's been this decline. The 45% or 48% think that the problem is other parents not disciplining their children. It sounds like my late grandmother. Again, it doesn't sound like anybody I know in the policy community. So my question is, A, am I right? Am I right that there's this difference of opinion between a lot of Americans and all of us in this kind of room? And B, if so, what should the relevance for policy be if there is that gap?
And the final question right here.
Thank you, Carlin. Larry Checo. One big question for me in all of this is, how do you define family? The evolution of family has changed a great deal. I'm very sensitized to this because we call her our nephew because she's come out as binary or non-binary. If we should pass a federal law regarding family leave, could we possibly enter into another hobby horse scenario where employers will have the right not to give family leave because that person doesn't fit their definition of family? Thank you.
Panelists?
So I can take the second one. I think, if you look at employers, what they are trying to stick to is just the narrowest definition of family, as most of us understand it, which is like the immediate parents, your children. But you're absolutely right. We don't know how those definitions are going to change. I think there's a lot of movement at the state level to define family, not along those lines, but to allow a broader definition that includes friends and family, extended family and things like that. From a policy perspective, I think the discussion has been, well, what's the cost of doing that? If you had a much broader definition of family, is there a potential for exploitation, abuse? What's the cost of that? So I personally don't see a federal definition of what defines family changing very fundamentally, and then over time. But
If you don't mind, I'd really like to narrow it down.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Owner of a business, and you are Christian right, hobby horse situation, and I'm
Hobby Lobby.
marriage guy, you're going to be able to say, hey, sorry,
Okay.
I can't do it. My religion won't allow me to do it.
I think you're asking a
If you
different
could answer
question.
quickly,
I
yeah.
think you're
It's a
asking
different
whether
question.
the right of employers is to discriminate against the spouse of a different gender now that we have same-sex marriage. But I think that it's a very difficult problem. If you look at the bills,
Yeah.
they actually go through these tortured
definitions of
definitions.
family.
One of them ends up actually saying that the person is defined as someone with whom your relationship is similar to a family relationship. So you literally end up defining family as being similar
As
to
being
family.
whoever you
It's
want to
totally
define, yeah.
circular. It's a bit of a nightmare. I think Daniel's point is the lag effect could well be right. It's just it takes people time to realize, the change. The only thing I would say to that is so we'll now see people getting more optimistic about family and seeing, we'll see that shift. But only if the same attention is paid to an improving trend as it was to a declining trend. And part of my fear is that that's just not as sexy. It's not as good a story. It's just boring that the divorce rate is, moderated. So that's where we have a responsibility, I think.
I want to thank
you.
all of our I want to thank all of our panelists and also
Good
the
point.
Brigham Young University and the Deseret News for the wonderful survey and a very provocative discussion, and one I think we could continue for a much longer period of time. Thank you for joining us this morning.